Good evening, buenas noches, and thank you for joining us tonight. On behalf of Mitchell Kaplan, the Miami Book Fair, and everyone at Books and Books, I'd like to welcome you to a virtual evening with Akwaeke Emezi to celebrate their new novel, The Death of Vivek Oji, published by Riverhead. Though the book begins with Vivek's mysterious death, the reader comes to know him through the life that preceded it, in moments of loneliness and exorbitant joy, and through the people touched by his short yet expansive existence, whose memory delivers his portrait. An instant New York Times bestseller, indie bestseller, and indie next selection, the New York Times Book Review hails The Death of Vivek Oji as a dazzling, devastating story, a puzzle wrapped in beautiful language, raising questions of identity and loyalty that are as unanswerable as they are important. Akwaeke Emezi's first novel, Freshwater, was named a New York Times notable book and shortlisted for the PEN/Hemingway Award, the New York Public Library's Young Lions Fiction Award, the Lambda Literary Award, and many other honors. Freshwater was also named a Best Book of the Decade by BuzzFeed and a Best Book of the Year by The New Yorker, NPR, and the Chicago Public Library. Their second book, Pet, was a finalist for the National Book Award for Young People's Literature, selected as a 5 under 35 honoree by the National Book Foundation. Akwaeke has been profiled by Vogue, for which they were photographed by Annie Leibovitz and by Vanity Fair as part of the new Hollywood Guard. Freshwater has been translated into 12 languages and is currently in development as a TV series at FX, with Akwaeke writing and executive producing. To moderate tonight's conversation, we've invited Nicole Dennis-Benn. Nicole is the author of Here Comes the Sun, a New York Times Notable Book of the Year, and a 2017 Lambda Literary Award winner. Her best-selling novel, Patsy, is a 2020 Lambda Literary Award winner, a New York Times Editor's Choice, among other honors. Patsy has also been named Best Book of the Year by Kirkus Reviews, Time, NPR, Washington Post, and The Guardian, among others. In addition to being a 2-time Lambda Literary Award winner for her novels Patsy and Here Comes the Sun, Nicole is a recipient of the National Foundation of the Arts grant and fellowships from MacDowell Colony, Lambda, and others. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, Elle, BuzzFeed, The Rumpus, and more. She was born and raised in Kingston, Jamaica. Throughout this evening's broadcast, please feel free to post your questions in the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen. And you can find The Death of Vivek Oji, Patsy, and any other book you might need for purchase at Books and Books below by pressing the green button. Every purchase you make helps keep Books and Books alive, so please hit that green button. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome Akwaeke to the stage.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all for being here. We're going to start with a little reading from the book. And I'm reading from a chapter that's narrated in third person, and then I'll read a little bit from a chapter narrated by Vivek's cousin Osita. And this section is about Vivek's parents. After Vivek died, their worlds drew even further apart. Chika didn't want to ask any questions. Kavita, though, was made of nothing but questions. Hungry questions, bending her into a shape that was starving for answers. They quarreled now, every day, from morning to night. "Will it bring him back?" Chika finally screamed at her one night after dinner, standing in the kitchen. "All these your questions, what will they do? My son is dead." "Our son," Kavita screamed back, throwing a plate at him. He ducked and it shattered against the wall. "Our son, our son." He had stared at her, then walked out of the room. But Kavita didn't care. She wasn't like him. She wasn't going to give up and sink into whatever trough of grief Chika wanted to fall apart and wallow in. Her questions were real. Who had returned Vivek's body to their door? Who stripped off her child's clothes, wrapped him in Akwaeke, and delivered him like a parcel, like a gift, a bloody surprise? Who had broken his head? It took the police several days to get around to making any kind of reports. They blamed it on the riots that had happened the same day Vivek died, the markets coughing black smoke over that side of town. "We had a lot of casualties there, madame," the officer had said. "This is what happens when touts take over a town." He leaned back in his chair, his eyes bloodshot. "My condolences to you and your family. We will continue investigations." "They won't continue anything," Chika said dully as he and Kavita left the station. "Vivek was probably robbed." "Then who brought his body home?" Kavita asked. "How did they know where we lived?" Chika turned his flat eyes on her. "At least someone did. At least we have a body to bury." He said that as if it was enough. As far as Kavita was concerned, that made him a liar, just like everyone else. Just like the police officer who told her weeks later that there was nothing more they could do for her. Just like Vivek's friends who kept telling her they didn't know what happened. It didn't make any sense. In those last few weeks of Vivek's life, his friends had been with him almost every day. Someone had to know something. They were just refusing to tell her. Kavita was sure of it. She didn't care if all the Niger wives thought she had gone crazy because she wouldn't just bury her son and shut up. If it had happened to them, they would be behaving exactly the same way. They had no idea what it was like to know in your marrow that someone had an answer to your questions, that someone around you was lying. They had no idea how every breath for her was hell. She was going to find the truth, even if she had to rip it out of his friends' throats. Someone had to know what happened to Vivek. Osita, I know what Auntie Kavita wants to know. I want to tell her that she is not prepared for the answer, the same way I was not prepared. That will hit her like a lorry, spilling its load over her chest and crushing her. But I also know that I'm afraid of what she will find out. If someone will tell her what was happening, if Vivek told someone else what was happening, if someone saw me that day, stop looking. I want to tell her to stop looking. Thank you.
Wow, that was beautiful, Akwaeke. Thank you so much for that reading. I was kind of reliving the book because I really didn't want it to end as I was reading it. It was, I sat down and read it in 2 days, literally. And for those who are not really familiar with the book, who haven't had the pleasure to really read it at length, or even hear any of your great interviews thus far, I just want you to tell them, what was the inspiration behind this book and why was it important to write now, or even get out into the world now?
Well, I actually finished writing it back in 2016. And so it was just kind of waiting its turn with all the other books.
Right.
But I had started it because I just finished writing Freshwater at the time. I wanted to write a book modeled after Gabriel Garcia Marquez's Chronicle of a Death Foretold, where the protagonist is killed at the beginning, and then you still have a book somehow, because I was like, this sounds like a challenge. Like, it sounds like a really difficult thing to do, and I wanted something that was challenging after Freshwater. I wanted a book that I would kind of write backwards. So Vivek started out as dead, and then I also wanted a book that I would write within the community of the Niger wives, because that's like a real community. My mom's a member, I grew up in it, and it's a very specific time in the book, in the late 90s, in Southeast Nigeria. We had just like transitioned over to democracy. It was really messy. There was a lot of like violence. And at the same time, you still had this community of like immigrant women from all over the world who were still raising their kids and trying to have like some semblance of normalcy amidst all the chaos. So yeah, that's kind of how Vivek was created.
Yeah, and okay, so I wanted to know the process too, because you write about grief so well. In fact, I mean, grief permeates the entire novel. In fact, I feel like it's a character itself, and so what was your process like writing grief in that way? I mean, you mentioned that you wrote the novel backwards, and yes, the first sentence literally starts with Vivek dying in the streets, the market burned on the same day. And I remember our conversation in May, I think it was May or June, with Entertainment Weekly, and you mentioned kind of off the cuff, you're like, oh shoot, like the one trans character in my book dies, you know. But at the same time, I still didn't feel like it was. I feel like the way how you wrote grief, Vivek still was like very much alive, and so was the characters. So the characters around Vivek, and so I just want to know your process in writing that for us. You know, painting this colorful world and this colorful character.
Yeah, you know, I wanted it to really feel. I wanted people. Adjusting myself. I wanted people to be able to feel like the love that Vivek had in his life. One of the reviews, I think on NPR, they said that nobody loved Vivek impurely. And I like that a lot because it was like, yeah, everyone was loving him the best way that they could, even when they weren't necessarily doing the best job at it. It was the best that they had to offer at the time. And so he was really surrounded by love, especially with his friends, especially with that like chosen community that he had created. And I wanted to show that. And I also wanted him to be, you know, like loud and present, no matter what his, you know, corporeal state was. So I wanted to put in those chapters, you know, where he's talking from beyond the grave and he's still there, because even after his death he's still so present for everyone else that I wanted the reader to be able to feel him as well.
Yeah, amazing. And another thing too, you know, there was this line, and I hope you don't mind me reading this line, because this is one of my favorite lines in the book. In fact, it's a paragraph. I'm not what anyone thinks I am. I never was. I didn't have the mouth to put into words, to say what was wrong, to change the things I felt I needed to change. And every day it was difficult, walking around and knowing that people saw me one way, knowing that they were wrong, so completely wrong, that the real me was invisible to them. It didn't even exist to them. So if nobody sees you, are you still there? Oh my God, that very powerful, powerful line. And I mean, everything was just powerful about that, but that one line, if nobody sees you, are you still there? And you know, before I even ask you to expand on this for us, there's so much things happening here too with spirituality in terms of the spiritual realm and physical realm. And I think you did that in Freshwater for sure. And here we come back with Vivek, but this is more like a reincarnation, but also the questioning of whether or not you're there or not. If nobody really knows your real existence, like, you know, are you just a figment of their imagination? So can you expand on that for us, especially those, again, you know, for those who haven't read it, and also, you know, explaining to those who have read it.
Yeah, I wanted to, you know, just write about this concept of being seen. And, you know, are you seen when other people witness you? Are you seen only when you witness yourself? And I think that's a question that I personally have not managed to answer. And I think a lot of people are trying to answer that, where it's like, you know, which one is your true self? Is it the self you are when you're by yourself? Is it when you're with people who you feel most comfortable with? Is it with the people who raised you? And there are all these different facets of self. Some of them, some people can see. And there's also the thing of, you know, if everyone can see bits and pieces of you, are you then the summation of all those disparate parts kind of like glued together? Who knows? But I think that's one of the things that Vivek is definitely trying to figure out in his coming of age.
Right. Yes, I love it. And another thing that that I was fascinated by too is that, you know, you do have Vivek as a very complex character. You know, there was no point in time where I was like, oh my gosh, like who's this person? I felt like, you know, the grief that followed Vivek from the first time the grandmother passed away, you know, having the same birthmark on the foot, under the feet. So being born the same day your grandmother died, and that has followed him throughout the entire process. But when, you know, you mentioned that, you know, you were inspired by this community of Niger wives that you also grew up in. And I just want to know, in terms of even getting deeper into Vivek, you know, how did you know, because I teach character development as well to my students. And in terms of the person that you wrote Vivek as, like they're highly complex for sure, but also, you know, suffers from these fugues, as you call it. And in addition to that, you know, walks out in the middle of the street, you know, leaving his friend's house, for example, dressed as, you know, in a nice, beautiful dress, the long hair, all of those things. Like, I love that you wrote a person that's not fearful of their environment. You know, you do have the backdrop of like, yes, it's highly homophobic, it's highly transphobic, but yes, still Vivek is just is. And so, what was your decision to capture that in a character, to actually have a character exist in a world that they know is restrictive for sure, but is so willing to defy that just willingly? You know, what was the decision to do that?
I think it just came as like part of who Vivek was. Like you said, there's no fearfulness there, and Vivek is someone who doesn't move from a space of fear. Like his
Right.
center is not fear-based. He's in really good contrast to Osita, whose center is based in fear. So you really get to see like what someone who moves from fear looks like, because you see it so much with Osita. And then it kind of loops into the fact that Osita can't really look at himself directly because of that same fear.
Yes.
And Vivek is the opposite, where Vivek has no problem looking at himself and confronting whatever that is and exploring that wherever that takes him. You know, he's pretty flexible about all of it. And yeah, so when it comes to like his coming of age, whether it's about his sexuality or his gender expression, he's pretty chill and laid back. The main problem he has is a spiritual one, that he's an unacknowledged reincarnation. And that's the part that like he's having a hard time figuring out, and it's showing up in these blackouts. It's showing up with like, physical symptoms. And that was because I wanted to just write the story of what happens if you don't give somebody the correct reincarnation name in our culture. Like, would there be repercussions for that? What would those repercussions be? And how would that person arrive at a form of healing, which Vivek did by naming himself properly?
Yes, and that definitely comes out. You know, I love that. You know, you stripped away so many layers just to bring that forward, and you did it so flawlessly. So I'll commend you for that. And you know, honestly, too, one of my favorite characters is actually Osita.
I love him. He's so tortured. Bless his heart.
I know. I wanted him to be okay, you know, and for some reason, you know how that saying, you know, sometimes things have to die in order for some things to live. I feel like you know, at least Osita knew love. You know, yes, he knew loss as well, but he knew love. You know, Vivek saw what he was going through and made him feel okay, made him feel safe. You know, in his own words, you know, there was this line, you know, when they first made love, this beautiful, beautiful love scene. And, you know, he said, I died at his mouth, you know, and, you know, that was like, wow, it was just a beautiful moment, you know. And I just, one thing though, that you did, that I'm going to bring up here, and I hope I'm not spoiling for anyone, but I think not. So you also explore, you push boundaries as well with this book, because you know it's so easy for people to focus on, okay, yes, the transphobia and homophobia, you know, which blatantly, I mean, that's like back noise compared to what he did in terms of the spirituality aspect. But another thing too, where you actually question, it's like you're daring us to like look at these queer, quote unquote queer relationships all around. You have two first cousins falling in love with each other. One, you have, I mean, there's infidelity, you know, that's going on.
So much
There's a brother who's in love or was in love with his brother's wife, you know, all those things. And I'm like, oh my God, like, you know, my eyes were like wide for those things, you know, not the other stuff, but that, as you know. So I just love that you kind of held up this mirror, like, you know, you guys, I know where you guys going with this, I know where your eyes are going to go to, but look here, you know. And that's basically what you were saying, and I just love that. And so, you know, so my question then, you know, as I write it, what was your decision, like when you saw that Vivek and Osita were going in that direction? Did you ever pull back and say, oh my God, like, where is this going? Or were you like, all right, I'm going to go for this? Like, was that difficult?
Oh, it was part of the plan for the book from the beginning.
Okay.
And part of it was because I was like, it was definitely a holding up the mirror aspect to it, because I think that a lot of people are pretty hypocritical about like relationships between cousins. Like, I've heard a lot of people be like, oh, you know, that's just like some redneck thing. And I'm just like, okay, so here's the thing though. In a lot of our cultures, like Black people, people of color,
Yes.
first of all, I was like, first cousins get married. Like
Right.
my grandparents are from Sri Lanka and they're cousins. They are related to each other. I don't think they're first cousins, but they're definitely related. And I'm just like, there is a very old cultural precedent of first cousins getting married that has nothing to do with white people. Like white people are not even part of like the thinking about this. But also, I'm like, in a lot of our cultures as Black people, I'm like, when you grow up in like these big extended families, I didn't, but I spent enough time with extended families of other people during the holidays. And when you raise a bunch of kids in an extended family together and they all hit puberty at the
Right.
same time,
Yes.
most of them, like, well, not most of them, a significant number, there are people who then their first like sexual experimentation is with their cousins or like the
Right.
really close family friends, like, but it's with the people that you grew up with. And I was
Yeah.
just like, oh, we're here like, pointing fingers and saying that like, oh my goodness, we don't do that. I'm just like, except we actually absolutely do that. And so what does it look like to kind of like peel the carpets back on that? Since everyone wants to just like sweep it under and be like, oh no, we don't do that. That's gross. I'm like, you kind of do though. So let's look
Yeah.
at it in this way, and let's look at it from like the inside of the relationship. Let's look at it in this like wholesome, tender way. And that way it also kind of pushes against what people might think of like cousins having a relationship,
Yeah.
because there have been like a few readers who, I love them so much. They talk about the book and they're like, so no one's talking about the incest? And I was like, that's a really fair point. Like some people were really uncomfortable with it. I'm like, that's a really fair point. People were not talking a lot about the incest. And I was like,
Yeah.
I think we should. And yeah, I like that it's tender and taboo at the same time. And I also wanted to challenge people's idea of what is, transgressive by showing it from showing it from within, from how Vivek and Osita feel, not how anybody else feels about their
Yeah.
relationship, but how both of them feel. And I think that's something when we think about like relationships that are considered deviant, is that people are often like looking at it from the outside and being like, ew. And I'm like, if you were able to experience it and follow the journey of it from the inside, would that change how you felt about it?
Yeah, beautifully said. And a friend of mine, we were talking about this book. I think it was yesterday, and we mentioned the cousin factor. And you're right. When you talk about even colorism, marrying within the family, just to maintain that the lightness, right? Yeah, and so that's basically what that is. So thank you so much for humanizing it here, and not even humanizing it, like just showing a light. And I love what you said about seeing it from the inside, as opposed to that outside looking in, that gaze, that judgmental gaze. So another thing too, that I found interesting with this book too, because I feel like Vivek is very much, open and out and really, like she knows, or that's coming later. They know, or he knows, because I'm saying he, because right now we're referring to
Yeah.
right now. Know himself, right? But one thing though that was really interesting is that Kavita and Chika were the only ones that he kept this from. Like the friends knew, and I have a feeling that Juju's mother knew as well. I forgot her name at this point. Maya, is it, or Maya? Yeah, she knows, or she knew, and I felt like Chico and Kavita were the only ones kept in the dark. I don't know if I skipped a line or something. Like why did he keep that from them? Because I feel like seeing Vivek, it feels like Vivek would have like said something or mentioned something, but I guess not. But why keep from Kavita and Chika, or was he keeping it from them?
I think it's a complicated thing because it's not stated, explicitly in the book. It's like his friends definitely knew. There's a high chance that other people might have known, like some of the other parents perhaps. But one of the things that I wanted to kind of touch with that was this idea of like young queer or trans people having a life that is just simply private, not necessarily hidden out of shame or fear. But I'm like, what does it look like for Vivek just to be like, this is mine? And I don't
Yeah.
want to share it with my parents.
Right.
Like I want to share it with my friends and at this time, and I don't want my parents to have access to it. And I think a lot of the times we operate under this assumption that like parents should have like all the access they want to their
Right.
children and to parts of their children's identity. And if they don't have that access, then we kind of frame it as like a tragedy. Like, oh, how sad that, Vivek died without his mother, like really knowing that. And I'm just like, okay, but whose desire is that centering? Is it
Mm,
centering Vivek's desire? Or is it centering his mother's desire? Or is it
right.
this assumption that like queer people always want to be seen by straight people, as if the straight gaze is like the thing that validates us and makes us real? And it's like, what does it look like for a young person to just be uninterested in
Yeah.
that and to have made the decision to have a separate life? Because I mean, all the rest of his expression wasn't hidden. Like he was just doing it like freely at home. And then there was a point where he was like, okay, I want this to be more private. And
Yeah.
yeah, I wanted to touch on the idea of like privacy for young queer people,
Yeah.
despite their parents perhaps wanting more access, and just kind of that entitlement to access that I think a
Mm,
lot of people feel, where it's like, well, you have to come out, you have to announce what you are, you have to like open the door and let us in. And I'm like, straight people don't have to do that. So like, why should
that's
Vivek?
wow. I mean, you just taught me basically, because I was actually of the train of thought, like, yeah, you have to come out, like, bust out the closet already, but I really respect what you just said. I like it. Because yeah, I mean, why submit to the other's gaze, right? And so I love that in this book within itself, you carved a safe space. You carved a safe space for Vivek and Osita, their relationship. You carved a safe space for Vivek to be who he is. You carved a safe space for Juju and Elizabeth, to be girlfriends, to be lovers. Which is I think it was another favorite puppy love scene of mine, between the two girls going back and forth, like, oh yeah, we're girlfriends now. I love it. And that was beautiful. And growing up in Jamaica, I felt I envied this. I was like, I wish I had that. I wish I had that space in somebody's bedroom to just go and just be. And yes, it doesn't have to be your mommy and daddy knowing. It's just like you being free in that moment, and it's completely a teenager's world, or a young person world. And yes, I get it. So thank you for that explanation again.
Oh, of course. I think that's the beautiful part. It's like that intimate world of just having the bedroom. And like I think with even writing this book, I wanted to create like that possibility for like young
Yeah.
queer people to read it and just be like, oh, can I have this? Like young people living back home be like, oh, can I have this? Like, is it possible to build worlds like these? Because I think a lot of the time, like we're taught that, oh, the only way we can have like valid spaces or whatever is if we are allowed to have them by straight people. If like, your parents and this and that and all this. And I'm just like, there's so much again and I think really, especially in our cultures, it really starts with like the parents and like the immediate family, where they're just like, oh, your parents have to accept you. And like, yes, that's a whole thing, would be great, awesome. However, for a lot of us, I'm like, that's not going to happen.
Right.
Like it's
Right.
not going to happen. So then what then? Do you keep, one of the things I've been saying is like, do you just keep throwing yourself against the gaze of someone who has committed to not seeing you and just
Yes.
do that indefinitely? And that's actually kind of encouraged, where people are like, oh, don't give up on them. Like, oh, it's your parents, be patient, blah, 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 blah. And it's like, you just throw yourself against the gaze over and over. And they're fine. They're fine. You're the one who's going to break from doing all that throwing against something that doesn't want to see you. And so I'm like, what does it look like to just be like, you know what? I'm just going to, one of my friends, Anne, she says this thing all the time, go where you are loved. And what does it look like to kind of turn and like create that chosen family? I
Yeah.
personally am a big fan of like disowning blood family for
Yeah.
being like bigoted, because I'm just like when I first came out, like I was like, and I don't usually talk about like my gender or sexuality, but my friends and I were like talking about it, and I was just like, oh, I wasn't worried about my parents disowning me. I was like, they should be worried about me disowning them. Because I was like, I'll be fine. I was like, y'all are going to be really, really hurt about this because like y'all are the parents. You created me. I'm just going to keep going on with my life. And it's going to hurt you more than it hurts me. So
that is so
kind
real.
of disownment.
Yeah. And you know, I was reading something about you too, Akwaeke. I think you and I kind of maybe have crossed paths. I don't know. Like I came to the city in 2006, and that was in the throes of like, you know, this whole like, of course, I came out to my parents and kind of got quote unquote disowned for a minute. And I found my chosen family in Brooklyn. You know, I was in the Brooklyn scene. Yes, yes. Oh my God.
Absolutely. I came in like 2010. And then it was like Rivers of Honey and all of the like.
That was where Friday nights. Yes.
Oh, it was such a place. I like performed there. I did like spoken. I remember the first time I did like spoken word at Rivers of Honey, and it was a whole poem about plantains. And it was like apparently a really sexy poem, which I didn't know because I was just like a little baby queer. And then all these people came up to me afterwards and they were like, so plantains, you know, I like mine with like honey and cinnamon. And I was just like, do you? That's such an interesting recipe. I will make notes of that. I had no idea what was happening. As a baby.
I love it. Listen, that was a saving grace. Like that was like, you know, if I didn't have that scene, if I didn't have Brooklyn, if I didn't have it, I don't know what I would have done. And I feel like you kind of recreated that in your book. You really recreated that. Well, in a different country for sure, different realm, but still, I felt that. And yeah, I really appreciated that. So yes, I feel like all the queer Nigerians that you want to read this book, they will read it and say, yeah, I could do that. You know, and also Jamaicans too, you know. But yeah, definitely. And so another thing too, I wanted to ask you too, about this book, because another, you know, we mentioned the Niger wives, which I love that community, by the way. It's so interesting. Do you think that because I'm picturing a community of these people, and they have, you know, their own, well, maybe their own market. The only time they venture out of this community is to go to the markets or wherever. Do you think that this was a protective community, you know, where, you know, had Vivek been raised like, you know, I've never been to this community. I've only been to Lagos like twice. But let's say it was like some random place in the middle of Lagos, and it's like it's not the wives of it's not expat wives. It's more like, oh well, Nigerians who are working class, perhaps, right? Do you think it would have been like the element of protection would have been there as much?
I honestly don't know, because like part of why I set the book where it is because the town that I grew up in is like so specific, and the lived experience there is miles away from Lagos. Like Lagos is like a port city. It's like a much wealthier city, even though like just like the rich are much richer there. And the town that I grew up in was like this really relatively small commercial town where we had factories. Like it was a market town, and it still is actually. Like my dad still lives there. We had factories and markets, and like it was very commercial town. So even the Niger wives, what was I think particularly interesting about that is that they didn't function as an expat community. Like they didn't have like that level. Like a few of them were like well off, but like my mom's best friend was from Austria, and she worked as a primary school teacher. It was like a bit more, and the point of the Niger wives was for the women to assimilate into Nigerian society. So, you know, one of them worked as a primary school teacher. The woman who owned and ran the school I went to is a Black woman from Ohio. So she was there were actually a lot of educators. And so it wasn't necessarily like working class, but it was like, I guess, lower middle class. I don't know how class systems work. Clearly. But
it was and all of that. Yeah.
Exactly. So it was like everything was kind of like down to earth. You know, we weren't particularly, you know, well off, and so I think they definitely tried to be protective just in terms of all the stuff that was happening in that town, because also a lot of the things that were happening in the town I grew up in were not happening in Lagos, which I didn't actually know until I was an adult. And I was talking to someone in Lagos about all the things that happened. And I was like, yeah. And then there were the riots. And then, you know, we closed down school for 4 days because they were burning all the thieves. And then there was like the whole thing where they burned down the mosque because they killed the Christians in the north. So then everyone in the south started killing Muslims. And it was, and she was just like, what? And I was like, what? Didn't you grow up like that? And she was like, no. Like my friends who grew up in Lagos, they were like taking Swahili classes and riding horses. Like they were in a completely different world.
Right.
They were like riding horses. And I was just there like, wait, what? I'm like, we had like a state imposed curfew because there was too much violence in our town.
Yeah.
It was very different, you know, but it was also, the Nigerian community was small and tight enough to where like, we were like, everyone kind of knew each other, and our parents were so close that even though we drifted apart as teenagers, we still could identify each other. It was like, ah, yes, that's Auntie Olga's daughter, that's Auntie somebody's son, so and so. And I wanted to kind of write in Vivek, what would it look like if we didn't drift apart? If we kind of got even closer together the older we got, and you know what that would have looked like. But I think like my memory of when my mom was around was definitely a lot of protectiveness. Like we weren't allowed to leave the house unsupervised. Like my mom was like, no one takes out her children, and she was just very much like, just no. She was like, if I'm not there, and she started working in Saudi Arabia. Sorry?
No sleepovers?
We were only allowed sleepovers with my best friend, whose mom was a Niger wife.
Okay.
So it's like we were allowed sleepovers within the community, but outside of that, it was just like, And when we were much younger, my mom was like, you know, no one takes the kids out of the house. And then we had a cousin who visited and broke the rule and took us out of the house because we begged. We were so bored. We were like, come on. She was going to buy salt. And we're like, yeah, it's just a little errand. And in that little errand, my sister got ran over by a pickup truck. So my mother was deeply not amused by the rule being broken. And I was just like, you know what? You had a point. We should have stayed in the house.
Oh, God, that's terrible. I was like, in my mind, I was like, oh, please don't let anything happen. But damn. Oh, well.
Yeah, it was real out there.
Goodness. Well, listen, Akwaeke, I could go on and on because, you know, you answered most of my questions concerning this book. So what I want to know to ask, or maybe you answer this question in another way, but what's next? No, before that, what do you want others to get from this book? Because I mean, we're now talking about like, you know, I mean, we have a lot in common as queer individuals, and I mean, I know for sure that our people will get things from this book. But what about like those who are like, you know, they're strolling through bookstore and they're like, oh yeah, let me pick this book and buy it. What do you want others to get from this book, if you do want them to get anything from this book?
I don't really have a desired outcome. Usually when the books come out, I'm really curious just to find out what they get from it, because I think it's so unpredictable. And, you know, I say all the time that I'm never able to experience my books as a reader. So I'm just like, I never know what it feels like to read my books because I wrote them. So I'm like, I'm never going to get to read this book without knowing what happens at the end. And when the book comes out, one of my favorite parts is like seeing how readers respond and engage to it, because then it's like I get to kind of live vicariously through them. And I'm just like, oh, that made you feel that way? You like that light? Oh, that's so cool. So I'm very like open about that. I'm just like, I just want to see what it is. I don't have like an attachment. If it's something like problematic, then I'll like call it out a little bit, usually in reviews, not really with readers. I just kind of leave readers to do their own thing, because reader spaces are reader spaces. Authors don't yell at anyone on Goodreads. So like readers are entitled to their space. But I really just, I think it's a privilege when people just share kind of how the book affected them and what they took from it. Like, it's such a gift to me because it's something that I don't get to experience. So to receive it from someone else is like a really big gift.
Yes. And in all honesty, I don't want to give away the ending because we all know what happened, and I don't want the other readers to not experience that shock that I experienced. But I missed Vivek. You know, you wrote it in a way where I did miss Vivek. I was like, no, why? Like, and I just think there were so many beautiful moments, and I think Vivek changed the lives around him for sure. So the one last question I have then, because I messed up, I was like, oh my God, am I messing up by saying Vivek as a him? The people closest to Vivek, Osita and Jojo especially, even in the retelling, they still refer to Vivek as him, not her. Even though they knew the name and all of that, they still said him. Is there a reason for that? Is that because it has occurred to them, or?
No. There's a reason for it, and they actually shared a reason in the book when they're talking to his mom at some point. They explained that like Vivek was comfortable with either like being referenced either way, and the reason why I did that was because I really wanted to like let go of this idea of like linear transitions and linear paths of gender, where it's just like, well, you were this and that wasn't real, and then you came out and you had like this, huge announcement to straight people who you were, and then after that everything gets better and you live your wonderful life, and it's just like a straight line. And I'm just like, that's not how it works for like a lot of queer people. For a lot of us, it's very like wiggly, and you're constantly like realizing things about yourself, expressing yourself differently. So this idea that like, oh, who you were like a week before is suddenly invalid and inauthentic, I'm just like, that's kind of bullshit. I'm like, what does it look like for this character to be authentic at every single step of this whole thing, every single step of his experience, of his explorations, like every single step is real. What does it look like to collapse that like linear binary concept of gender and gender transition, and to have someone who kind of like lives in the liminal spaces of it and is firmly there? Because like, a couple of people asked me early on about like dead naming Vivek, and I was like, who said it was a dead name? Vivek didn't. So I was like, where did that come from? And it comes from that linear narrative.
Yes, exactly. Well, thank you so much, Akwaeke. This has been an amazing conversation.
Thank you so much for doing it with me.
We have a few questions and comments from the audience, if you have time for a few. Okay, let me see. So thank you so much for writing this beautiful, beautiful book. One of my all-time favorite lines in caps, is some people cannot see something soft without hurting it. I may not quote it correctly, and we'll go back to it. Many blessings to you. That's from Imune Herzog. Here's a question from Ellis. Why did you choose to make Vivek and Osita cousins?
I think we answered that early on in the conversation.
Yeah.
Okay. Here is from Diane Liederman. Just want to say how rich this book was. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane.
A question from Leslie. What are you currently working on right now? Pet was great. Are you going to write more YA books?
I am currently working on projects that I cannot talk about because they haven't been announced yet. But there is more YA down the pipeline coming, and a couple of other genres as well.
Nice.
Can you tell us about the FX series? A little bit about that?
It's in development. TV, I've learned, is, I thought it was impossible for any industry to be slower than publishing. Yeah, I was so wrong. I was so wrong. But it's going well. It's really exciting to be able to executive produce on it, which basically just means like I'll be a showrunner when we like kick it off, and it's nice because I also get to play around with the work in a way that's very different from the book. Like, one of the things, I'm not one of the authors who's like, oh, this has to be exactly like the book. I'm like, let's change it, because the book already exists, And I'm like, and the book is the most accurate version of itself. I don't think I could replicate it in another form. So for me, doing something in TV is a chance to like play around with it a bit and see what happens.
Great.
Nice.
Great. Well, This has been fantastic. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining us. Thank you on behalf of Books and Books, the Miami Book Fair. We've been selling this book a lot at our stores. Please, everyone, remember that if you don't have it yet and you're watching tonight, you just need to click the green button and we will ship it right off to you. I wish we could now fold up our chairs and go into the next room and do the autographing, but we will someday in the future. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for everyone who's watching from everywhere tonight. Stay safe, be well, and until the next time. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.